So we're going to take this one step further. We're going to take our BMI calculator. This time we have a BMI calculator with fragments. So it behaves like this. I want you to remember this. We have a BMI calculator with fragment and one without fragment. I'm going to show you the one with fragments now, and we're going to make fragments talk to each other. So for example, if I had, I don't know, 160 and 68 inches, my BMI was that. Now, with fragments, the good thing about fragments is that we could have different layouts without much effort. So if I flip the phone, in this orientation, I had a disclaimer here, BMI is simply an approximation of body fat, right? Now, what if, and then I can recompute the BMI. Now, what if I wanted this side here to say something based on what my BMI was? Okay, for that I will have to communicate the results of this fragment to this other fragment to make a decision on what to say. So this is exactly what we're going to do. This is exactly what we're going to do now. All right. To do this, first I'm going to review a few things. I have the main activity from which both fragments span. I have my BMI fragment, which is all the calculations, which handles this part, okay? And I have my disclaimer fragment, which was basically the little note that I had on the side. In my disclaimer fragment, I'm going to create a little function to actually decide what to say. Now, to decide what to say, I need a place to put it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the layout of my fragment disclaimer. BMI is simply an approximation of body fat, has my ID disclaimer. I'm going to add, because the advice that I give might be a few lines long, I can add this attribute lines and put, I don't know, 4 lines. I can even have a size attribute. You can also do this from the visual, the design view here of this, but I'm showing you how to do it from the XML. You can say text size, and then the sizes that you have a bunch of sizes here, okay, that you can choose from. I would say text size display 1 material. Why not? We'll see what that text size looks like in the end. But we have this. My text view, my ID is disclaimer. Okay, that is very important. All right. So I have my text view set up to display my advice. Now I'm going to go to my disclaimer fragment, and I'm going to create a little function that, based on the BMI, it will tell me what to put in that text view, what the advice is going to be. So what I have here is I have a double. So I have a little function called, I'm going to say, set advice. Set advice receives the BMI as a string. Again, because I'm generating in the text field, I might as well have a string. BMI sets the advice as a string. It converts it into a double. Then it links this little variable advice with the actual disclaimer text field. So this is the XML's disclaimer text field. Now, to link this from a fragment, this is an interesting part. To link this from a fragment, you have to first get the view that the fragment is addressing, and then from that view you do the find view by ID and you find your component. That returns a view, therefore you have to cast it to the text view, which is really what the component is at its core. So we're going to create this advice. Then I'm going to have a string default response, you're fine. And then what I'm going to do is the conditions for the different responses. Once I have the response string set up to whatever I want, then I will use this advice text field and I will set the text to whatever that response is. This, in theory, if I give it a BMI value, it should set the text to whatever advice I give based on that value. Okay? That's theory. It does nothing. Nobody's calling, nobody's using this method, but I wanted to get it set up right there. Now, if this fragment here, which again is this portion of my application, if the BMI fragment wants to talk to the disclaimer fragment, it must do so through the BMI calc activity. It must say something, it must send the information to the BMI calc activity, which in turn will send the information to the disclaimer fragment. We never want two fragments to talk to each other. Okay? So this is how I do it. Well, I want to put this, now if I'm on the BMI fragment, right, on the BMI fragment, in the BMI fragment, in the previous video about fragments, we were setting the text to the BMI. I'm going to change this a little bit. I'm going to have a little string BMI here, which will be set to the actual BMI, and I will set the text to whatever that BMI value is. And the other thing is somehow I have to tell the parent activity that the value of the BMI, right? Of the BMI. And the way I do this, well, all fragments have a method called getActivity. So getActivity will actually return the activity that is the parent of this fragment. So I'm going to have an object of type BMI calc activity. I'm going to call it BMI calc activity, BCA. It's going to be the getActivity. Of course I have an error. The method getActivity returns an activity class, and BMI calc activity extends activity, but it's not just a mere activity. Therefore, I have to cast it, BMI calc activity. So, getActivity will get the parent activity of this fragment, and I will put in the value BCA. Now I can use this activity. So I would be able to give the BMA to that activity. There's no way for me to give this method to that activity unless I have some variable to hold it. So we'll keep this in the back burner. We're going to go to the BMI calc activity, and we're going to create a global variable string BMI that will actually hold the BMI. We're going to create a little method here, public void set BMI. I'm going to pass it a string. This is just a simpler setter. This BMI equals BMI. So what I've done here is a simple setter to set the BMI. I'm going to go back to my BMI fragment. When I got the parent activity, now because the parent activity is a BMI calc activity, I can say set BMI. I'll pass it this variable BMI that I've just calculated. Okay, so this is how my fragment, this fragment, once I click on BMI on the BMI button, will compute the BMI, will set the output value to whatever that BMI is, and will pass that value to the originating activity. Now what's left to do is to have this originating activity pass the value to the disclaimer fragment where actually the advice should be given. And we will do this at the set BMI because we actually want this to set the BMI there. So as soon as we click set the BMI, it'll pass the contents to that activity, and that activity will actually set the text field of the disclaimer fragment. Okay, so the first thing that I have to do is, because this activity may contain fragments, contains two fragments, I will do this. I will create a variable of type disclaimer fragment df equals, and then here's an important method of an activity. I have a method called getFragmentManager. That gets me all the fragments, and I can find a fragment by ID, just like I can find XML components by ID. And then disk fragment is the name that I actually gave the fragment in my XML. So if we go to my activity BMI calc, for example, with landscape, here disk fragment is the second fragment, the disclaimer fragment. Now there's an error because it provides a fragment, not a disclaimer fragment. So I need to cast this disclaimer fragment. Now it's casted. Now I have this fragment. Now recall a couple of things about the application. I'm going to show you something. In this view, when it's in portrait, you don't see the disclaimer fragment. However, when it's in landscape, you actually do see the disclaimer fragment. So there are times in which you see it and times in which you don't. For that in the code, we have to say if the disclaimer fragment is not null and the disclaimer fragment is in layout. So basically, if it's not null and I can see it, right? Let me do this. If it is not null and I can actually see it, then I'm going to do df dot set advice, and I'm going to pass this BMI variable that I just computed, right? So set BMI in the activity. Remember, I'm in the activity. The BMI fragment passed me the BMI value. Okay, now I set it to the BMI global variable just in case I want to use it again, but here's the important part. I looked up the other fragment, the fragment that I want to put this, that needs to use this variable. And if it is null, and if it is in the layout, and if it's not null, then I will call the method setAdvice of this fragment. SetAdvice on this fragment, remember, receives a string BMI and does all the necessary magic, if you will, to actually get a response and set the text field to that response. So now we have a full circle. We have the set BMI, which will set everything in the activity and pass this information to the disclaimer fragment. And in the BMI fragment, when I click my button and compute the BMI, I will be passing that BMI value to the activity. So basically, the BMI fragment with this method will give the BMI calc activity the value of the BMI. And the BMI calc activity, through this method, when it's given the value, will actually give the disclaimer fragment that value and will ask it to do whatever it is that it needs to do with it. So let's try it. We need to wait for it to build, and we'll see what happens. By the way, I'm going to close this guy. All right, so let's run it. My computer's running slow, but it will run soon. There. So I will first flip the, well, I can do the, this 160 pounds, 68 inches. I compute the BMI, and that's fine. I'm in one frame. Now, what if I flip the screen? If I put it in landscape mode, I have this disclaimer. But when I compute the BMI again, it says you're normal in terms of BMI. It's actually passing this value, this 24.32, onto the main activity, and that main activity, when it receives it, gives it to this disclaimer fragment, which will display whatever is appropriate. So for example, if I put here 200 pounds and 68 inches, it'll say you're obese, please see a doctor. If I put 140 pounds and 68 inches, then it'll say you're normal in terms of BMI. If I put 120, then it'll say I'm underweight. So there you have it. Both fragments are now talking.